The nights have been quieter lately, the kind of quiet that settles over everything like a thick blanket, soft enough that even the smallest sound seems to travel a little farther than it should. Most people don't pay much attention to the way darkness behaves, but once in a while you notice things, the way the air cools when the sun slips away, or how the corners of a room feel a little deeper when the lights are low. This video is about those moments, the ones that start on ordinary nights when you're walking to your car or settling into bed or just stepping into a hallway you've crossed 100 times before. It's about the stillness that feels normal at first, until you realize you're listening too closely to it. Because sometimes the smallest irregularities are what stay with you. A faint glimmer where nothing should reflect. The quiet sense that you're not alone even when the house is empty. The feeling of someone's attention lingering on you, steady and patient, long before you ever turn your head to check. Most people brush these things off as tricks of the light or tired eyes adjusting to the dark, and maybe they are, at least at first. But every person in these stories reached a moment when that excuse stopped working. And as you listen, I want you to remember something simple but unsettling. Every story you're about to hear begins the same way, with someone minding their own business in the dark, thinking everything was fine right up until they noticed the eyes watching them. I've always lived in quiet places, the kind where the nights feel heavier than the days and the silence settles over everything like a second layer of air. When I first moved into that house, the thing I loved most was the long gravel driveway. It wound through a narrow stretch of trees before opening up to the house, and at dusk the whole place felt peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. The temperature always dropped a little more than you expected once the sun went down, and on most evenings I'd step outside just to breathe in the cool air before bringing the trash bins back from the road. It was a small routine, something ordinary, and I never imagined it would be the part of the day I ended up dreading the most. The first night it happened, I wasn't even thinking about anything strange. I remember walking down the driveway with my hands in my pockets, listening to the soft crunch of gravel under my shoes. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of someone's engine along the highway, muffled by the woods. It was one of those nights where everything seemed still, almost too still, and when I looked up, the sky was so clear that the stars looked sharp enough to cut through the darkness. About halfway down the driveway, I felt something, not fear, just a tiny hesitation, like a pause that didn't have a reason. I kept walking, but I slowed down without noticing. When I reached for the trash bin, I happened to glance toward the tree line at the far end of the drive, and that's when I saw them. Two faint points of light. They weren't moving and they weren't bright like a flashlight or headlights, just there, low to the ground at first glance, but somehow not matching anything I could easily explain. My first thought was that it might have been an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a stray dog. I stood there for a moment, waiting to see if the points shifted or blinked, but they didn't. They stayed completely still, and after a minute I convinced myself they were probably just light reflecting off something metal. A forgotten tool, maybe, something harmless. The next evening I went down the driveway again. Same darkness, same cool air, same low crunching of gravel. But this time I caught myself watching the tree line before I got to the bins. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. And sure enough, when I reached the bottom of the driveway and turned, the lights were there again. The same faint, unmoving glints starring from the exact same spot. I stared back for a little too long that night. Maybe I expected an animal to move or lose interest. But the lights didn't drift left or right, they didn't blink, and they didn't disappear when I took a few steps forward. If anything, they almost seemed aware, as if whatever they belonged to was waiting for me to look first. For a few days after that, I tried to ignore them. I'd bring the bins in quickly, keeping my eyes on the ground or the house, pretending I didn't feel the weight of something watching from the darkness. But ignoring something doesn't make it go away. I found myself glancing through the front window before going outside, checking the edge of the trees even though I knew I wouldn't see anything from that distance. The weird part was that the lights never showed up when I looked from inside the house. They only appeared once I stepped onto the driveway, as if they were waiting for me to be alone with them. That was the first moment I felt something deeper than unease, the sense that whatever was out there wasn't just passing by or curious. It was intentional. One night the air was unusually warm for the season, nearly still, and the sky was so dark it felt like a lid pressed over the trees. I walked down the driveway slower than usual, partly because the heat made me uncomfortable, partly because I didn't want to reach the point where I would have to look into that darkness again. I tried to remind myself it could still be something natural. A deer's eyes, maybe. That explanation worked until I realized how steady the lights always were. They never shifted, never wavered, never grew brighter or dimmer depending on where I stood. Even an animal gets curious or startled. This thing didn't. That night when I got to the end of the driveway and turned toward the trees, the lights were farther off the ground than I'd ever seen them. Higher. Almost eye level with me, even though the ground dipped down sharply near the tree line. My first thought, strangely enough, wasn't fear, it was confusion. I remember feeling the sweat start on my palms as I tried to calculate what kind of animal could stand that tall without making any sound. As everything around me was silent except for the very soft clicking of leaves brushing against each other far above. The points of light were steady, and wide, and watching. I stood there too long that time, long enough that the air around me felt heavier and my heartbeat got loud in my ears. And then, without really deciding to, I stepped forward. I don't know what I expected, maybe that the lights would blink or vanish or reveal something obvious. But they didn't, they stayed fixed as always. I walked slowly, counting each step on the gravel. By the time I was close enough to raise the small flashlight in my hand, I hesitated. There was something fragile about the moment, like shining the light would break whatever distance kept me safe. But I lifted it anyway, angling it toward the glints and finally clicking it on. The beam reached the tree line. For a split second, the lights reflected back at me and then they blinked. Not fast, not in surprise, but slow, deliberate, and too smooth to be human. The eyes didn't belong to any shape I could see. No outline, no body, nothing that made sense. Just two reflective eyes floating at the wrong height in the wrong place in a way that didn't belong to any living creature I knew. And as the light hit them fully, the eyes didn't dart away or retreat. They simply lowered, as if whatever was watching had leaned forward just slightly, the way someone might when they're trying to see you better. I don't remember running. I just remember being back in the house with the door shut and locked, my breath shaking and my chest tight. I turned off all the lights, hoping the darkness inside would hide me from whatever was outside. For a long time I listened. I half expected to hear footsteps on the gravel or the sound of something moving between the trees. But the night stayed quiet, too quiet. For the next few days, I avoided going outside after sunset. I even waited until morning to bring in the bins. But eventually, routine won over fear. You can't avoid your own driveway forever. When I finally went out again at night, I told myself it had been a one-time thing, that stress and darkness play tricks on people. And yet, when I reached the end of the driveway and turned, the eyes were there again. Lower this time, closer to the ground, watching like they'd never left. I didn't shine a light again. I didn't get closer. I just backed away slowly and walked up the driveway without turning my back on them. Since then, I've changed my habits completely. I bring the bins in while there's still sunlight. I avoid the windows after dark. And every so often, if I'm late coming home and the night is especially silent, I can feel the same hesitant pause I felt that first evening, the instinctive sense that something is waiting near the edge of the trees. And sometimes, when I forget to look away fast enough, I still see them. Just two faint glimmers hovering above the ground where the driveway ends. Never moving, never blinking, always waiting for me to step a little closer than I should. When I moved into that old rental house, I didn't think much about the basement. It wasn't the kind of place you show people proudly, just a narrow stairwell that led down to a cluttered space with concrete floors and metal shelves that came with the property. The house itself was quiet and drafty in that way older homes are, with wooden floors that clicked and settled whenever the temperature changed. I used the basement mostly for laundry, nothing more, and in the beginning, walking down those stairs at night felt like any other ordinary chore. The air was always a little cooler down there, and the low hum of the water heater made it feel lived in rather than abandoned. I didn't notice anything strange the first week or even the second. It was just a basement. But basements have a strange way of becoming familiar in the wrong order. You start by ignoring the small things, the light that flickers for 1 second too long, the door that doesn't always stay closed, the feeling that the temperature dips noticeably halfway down the stairs. I brushed those things off at first. Everyone does. It wasn't until late one evening when I was carrying a basket of clothes down that a faint irregularity crept into my routine without me noticing right away. I remember pausing at the top of the steps because I thought I heard something shift below, not loudly, just a soft adjustment like someone moving their foot on concrete. When I clicked the stairway light on, the sound stopped. It was small enough that I told myself it was just the house settling. The stairwell had a habit of collecting shadows, especially near the bottom where the light didn't quite reach. There was a spot there, a patch of deeper darkness just past the last step that always made me feel like the ground dipped slightly even though I knew it was flat. One night I was halfway down when I noticed something new. In that deepest part of the shadow, there were two tiny points of reflection, faint and still, like the glimmer you see when light catches a piece of metal. My mind immediately went to something simple, like nails sticking out of a shelf or a tool leaning against the wall. But when I aimed the stairwell light more directly, the reflections didn't brighten the way metal usually does. They just stayed the same, two tiny pinpoints in the dark. I blinked, looked again, and they were gone. That should have been reassuring, but instead it left me with a strange sensation in the pit of my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like my mind had just missed the frame of something it meant to catch. I did my laundry quickly that night, moving with the sort of forced normalcy people adopt when they don't want to admit they're uneasy. A few days went by before it happened again. I was coming home late, already tired, and I remembered I needed a clean shirt for the morning. I grabbed my laundry basket and headed toward the basement without even thinking. As soon as I opened the basement door, that cold draft rolled up the stairs, brushing past my legs like something slipping by. It wasn't unusual for the basement to be cold, but that night the air felt heavier, as if it had been undisturbed for too long. The stairwell light flicked once before holding steady, and halfway down I stopped again, not because I heard something, but because I felt watched. It's strange how quickly your senses sharpen when you're standing in an empty stairwell at night. You start noticing the small things you normally tune out, like the low vibration of the dryer cooling down or the distant metallic tapping of expanding pipes. And then when those normal sounds fade into the background, something softer appears. A quiet presence. Something you can't justify but can't ignore either. That was the first night I felt it clearly. Something at the bottom of the stairs waiting for me to make the next move. And that's when the reflections appeared again, fainter this time. Just two small points hovering slightly higher than before, perfectly still, perfectly aligned. I stared for a long moment, trying to convince myself they were nothing but the glimmer of metal again, but the longer I looked, the more they resembled eyes. Not shining, not bright, just reflecting the smallest bit of light back at me like dull mirrors. When I blinked, they blinked out of view not by moving, but as if the darkness itself swallowed them. I forced myself the rest of the way down the stairs, each step feeling strangely deliberate, like my body had decided to pretend everything was normal so my mind wouldn't panic. Laundry is a good distraction. Folding clothes, separating colors, checking pockets, it all gives you something tangible to focus on. For a while, I even managed to forget the stairwell entirely. But as I lifted the warm clothes from the dryer, I heard it again, that soft shift like weight redistributing on the last step. I turned immediately. The stairwell behind me looked empty, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had just moved out of sight. As after that night, everything changed. It wasn't sudden. It crept in the way shadows stretch when the light dims slowly, quietly, without drawing too much attention at once. The basement door began doing something it never used to, opening by itself, not wide, not enough to make a dramatic creak, just a few inches. Enough that every now and then I'd glance toward the hallway and see a thin strip of darkness where a closed door should have been. I tightened hinges, adjusted the frame, even propped a shoe against it a couple of times. No matter what I did, the door never stayed fully shut through the night. Soon after that, the reflections returned. Only now they weren't at the bottom of the stairs. They were on the stairs higher up each night, always right where the stairwell light faded into shadow. I tested it one night by standing at the top of the stairs with the light on and waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, 5 minutes, maybe 10, before I saw them appear on the fourth step from the bottom, just two glints, faint, watching. I held my breath, waiting for them to move. They never did. They didn't grow brighter or dimmer. They didn't shift left or right. They just stayed fixed, exactly at eye level for something standing 2 steps below that. I didn't go down that night. The worst moment came a week later. I had dropped a sock near the top of the stairs while carrying a basket. It rolled down a little, settling on the second step where the shadow always started to thicken. I sighed, knelt down, and reached for it. As I leaned over, I felt a change in the air, the way you feel someone step behind you, not loud, not obvious, just a small disturbance in the stillness. When I looked down fully, the reflections were right there. Level with me, not low, not distant. Not at the bottom of the stairs. They were inches from the step where my hand hovered. Up close, they didn't look like metal or icing from an animal. They looked wrong in a way I can't easily explain. Too steady, too centered, too aware. Every instinct I had screamed not to move, but my body took over before my mind could process anything. I pulled back slowly, stood up without turning my back, and closed the basement door with a shaking hand. I didn't run, I didn't slam anything. I just shut the door quietly, like making too much noise might draw something up the stairs. I didn't go back down for 2 days. Laundry piled up in a corner of my bedroom, and I told myself I would go down during the day. But even in daylight, the idea of stepping onto those stairs made my stomach twist. Eventually, I forced myself to open the door one morning just to prove nothing was wrong. The stairwell looked ordinary. Bright, empty, plain, no shadows where they shouldn't be, no faint glints watching from the darkness, just a normal basement. But normal basements don't feel like they're holding their breath. I walked down slowly, telling myself I'd been imagining everything, that stress and lighting and late nights were enough to trick anyone's perception. And for a moment, as I reached the bottom and started loading clothes into the washer, I almost believed it. The basement was quiet, peaceful even. Then I heard something, not a shift this time, not a footstep. A breathings. It was so soft I almost missed it. A slow inhale. A slow exhale coming from the stairwell behind me, not down the stairs on them, close. As if something was standing in the space just above the bottom step, calm and patient and unafraid. I turned around as slowly as I've ever turned in my life. The stairwell was empty, completely empty. But as I stared into that familiar patch of deep shadow, the cold air moved across my skin like someone walking past me. The glints didn't appear this time, nothing stared back, but somehow that made it worse. Because it meant whatever had been there wasn't trying to be seen anymore. I don't use the basement much these days. I take my laundry to a nearby laundromat and pretend it's because the machines there are faster. The basement door still opens on its own sometimes, just a few inches, and every now and then I catch myself glancing toward the stairwell after dark, half expecting to see those two faint reflections waiting on the steps. I never do. But I still avoid that staircase at night, because I can't shake the feeling that if I lean over it again, if I get just a little too close to the darkness, I'll finally see whatever has been watching me all this time. And I don't want to know what those eyes look like in full light. There's something special about camping far from the city lights, the kind of quiet that feels thick enough to rest on your shoulders and the darkness that settles in so completely it almost feels like another world. I used to love that feeling. It reminded me of being a kid, lying under the stars and listening to the soft wind moving through the trees. When my friend Ethan invited me on a weekend camping trip in early autumn, I didn't hesitate. The air had just started turning cold enough to smell like pine and distant wood smoke, and the forest felt calm in a way that made you want to breathe deeper. That first night, as the fire cracked softly and our lantern cast a warm circle of light around our tent, I remember thinking it was one of the most peaceful evenings I'd had in a long time. The tent was small, just enough space for two sleeping bags and our gear, with a mesh rooftop we covered with a thin, waterproof sheet. When you turned off the lantern, the inside went almost pitch black except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the fabric. It was comforting in a quiet, cocoon-like way. I fell asleep easily that night, listening to Ethan's soft breathing and the occasional rustle from the forest floor outside. As the temperature dropped steadily after midnight, and I remember waking briefly just to pull my sleeping bag closer around my shoulders. Everything felt normal, the kind of normal where the darkness doesn't feel threatening yet just natural. The first irregularity came so quietly that I almost thought I dreamed it. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a faint pressure above me, like the tent fabric had sagged in one small spot, lowering by just an inch or two. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even alarming at first. I just felt the presence of something shifting the air above me, pressing down slightly as if a small branch had leaned on the tent. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness. The air felt colder then, sharper, as if the warmth inside the tent had suddenly thinned. I whispered Ethan's name, but he didn't answer. He was asleep, breathing slow and steady. I lay there listening, not quite sure what I was waiting for. The pressure didn't increase, but it didn't go away either. And then I noticed something else, two faint spots of light filtering through the fabric directly above my face. They were small, soft, and weak, like reflections rather than anything shining. At first I thought they were stars, just bright enough to show through the tarp. But the longer I stared, the more I realized their glow wasn't steady like starlight. It pulsed almost imperceptibly, the way light changes when something shifts behind it. I didn't feel fear immediately, just an odd alertness, that sense of something, off that crawls through your body before you fully understand what's happening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of the moonlight, my eyes adjusting to the dark. Maybe the tarp was thinner than I thought, but then the 2 points drifted ever so slightly farther apart as if whatever they belonged to had tilted its head or repositioned itself over me. I felt a slow tightness form in my chest as I held my breath without meaning to, listening for any sound at all. There was no branch scraping the tent, no shifting weight on the ground. Just those two dim glimmers hovering above me, impossibly still. A minute passed, or maybe several, before the lights moved again, not away, not closer, just a slow, deliberate narrowing like eyelids lowering. I felt my heartbeat begin to pulse louder than the wind outside. It wasn't until that moment that I realized the pressure I'd felt hadn't been from above the tent. It was from directly on top of it, right where the thin tarp rested over the mesh. Something was leaning over us, perfectly balanced, perfectly quiet. The next few seconds stretched unnaturally long. I swallowed hard and whispered Ethan's name again, a little louder this time, but he didn't stir. His breathing didn't change at all. I was fully awake by then, every sense sharpened to a point. The cold air inside the tent felt too still, and for a moment I had the unsettling realization that I could no longer hear any forest sounds outside. No insects, no wind, no shifting branches, just silence. A silence so complete it felt wrong, as if the entire forest had stopped moving. I didn't dare sit up. I didn't dare move more than an inch. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint, hovering glimmers above me. At one point, they shifted again, drifting closer together in a way that made me realize something was lowering its face directly over mine, separated only by a thin layer of tent fabric. I felt a faint, warm breath through the tarp, so soft that I thought I imagined it until a second breath followed, slow and steady, timed with the pulsing movement of those dim reflections. My mind tried to find something rational, something that made sense. A raccoon climbing the tent, a large owl, maybe even a stray dog sniffing around. But none of those explanations matched the way the glimmers moved or the silence outside or the strange, even breathing hovering just inches from me. I lay there frozen, afraid that if I even exhaled too loudly, whatever was above us would react. At some point, Ethan shifted beside me and mumbled something in his sleep. The glimmers immediately shifted in response. I watched them tilt sharply, focusing on him now. The breathing above us paused, then resumed with a slower rhythm as if assessing whether he was awake. That was the first moment real fear hit me, not panic, just the deep, sinking realization that something intelligent was on top of our tent, watching us carefully. I don't know how long I stayed awake. Eventually the glimmers faded, either moving away or closing completely. The pressure above me lightened and the forest sounds returned one by one, quietly at first, then naturally. By the time dawn light seeped through the fabric, I wasn't even sure whether I had slept at all. But the one thing I needed to know was whether something had touched the tent. When we stepped outside that morning, the ground around the tent was undisturbed. No claw marks, no footprints, not even bent grass. But on the roof of the tent, right above where I had been lying, the tarp sagged slightly in a perfect oval, as though something had knelt or leaned there long enough to stretch the fabric. Ethan brushed it with his hand and frowned, but he didn't ask questions. Maybe he could see the look on my face. Maybe he didn't want to know. We stayed one more night, though I didn't sleep much. Nothing happened that second night. No pressure, no lights, no breath through the tarp. But that only made the first night feel stranger. Like whatever had been watching us had simply decided not to return, not because it was scared off, but because it had already seen what it wanted to. For years after that trip, I avoided camping. Even now, when people suggest it, I find myself hesitating. The thought of lying in a tent, with nothing but a thin layer of fabric separating me from the darkness above, makes my skin crawl. Because I still remember how close those faint glimmers were, how steady, how curious, how utterly silent. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed and the room is dark enough, I catch myself staring at the ceiling the same way I stared at the top of that tent, waiting, listening, wondering if something is leaning over quietly, watching just as patiently as it did in that forest. Because the part that unnerves me most, even now, is knowing that if I had sat up that night, if I had moved just an inch too boldly, I would have come face to face with whatever those eyes belonged to. And I don't think I would have forgotten its face. I'm just not sure I would have survived seeing it. I used to take the earliest bus to school every morning, long before the sun had even started softening the sky. It was the kind of hour where the world feels half asleep, the air colder than it should be, and everything looks slightly different than it does in daylight. The bus stop sat alone on a gently curving road lined with tall weeds and empty fields stretching out on both sides. Behind the stop was a narrow road that wasn't really used anymore, a straight path that dipped into darkness and disappeared behind a row of dead trees. Most mornings, I didn't think much about it. The faint buzz of streetlights, the crunch of loose gravel under my shoes, the distant sound of a truck on the main highway, all of it blended into a quiet, familiar routine. At that age, you don't question the dark, you just live around it. I'd sit on the cold metal bench rubbing my fingers together for warmth, watching my breath drift in slow clouds. The silence back then felt normal, safe even, but one morning, sometime in late winter when the nights stretched longer, I noticed something small that didn't fit into that familiar picture. It wasn't obvious. Just two faint points of light far down the empty road behind the bus stop. They were barely visible, almost like stars caught in the wrong place. I remember squinting, trying to decide whether they were reflections or maybe a stray car approaching from far away. But they didn't move. They didn't brighten. They didn't behave like headlights. They just hovered there, steady and low to the ground. At first, I didn't think much about it. I looked away, checked the time on my phone, watched a cloud of breath dissolve into the air. When I looked back, the two lights seemed closer, but I blamed it on my sleepy eyes. Early mornings can play tricks on you, especially when everything is dim and quiet. Still, something about those faint points lodged itself in my mind. I kept glancing back at them until the bus finally arrived, and as I climbed aboard, I took one last look out the window. The lights were gone. Over the next few days, the routine stayed the same, but I found myself checking that empty road before I looked anywhere else. Some mornings there was nothing at all, just darkness and weeds. Other mornings the lights were back, not always in the same spot, but always still, always watching. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was broken glass catching light. Maybe it was frost or metal or something harmless. But reflections don't appear only when someone is standing alone in the dark. They don't track you, they don't shift closer when you blink. One morning, I told myself not to look. I forced myself to sit on the bench facing the opposite direction. But I felt it, that strange pressure you get when something behind you demands attention. My shoulders tightened. My breathing grew shallow without me understanding why. Finally, when the silence became unbearable, I turned around. The road was empty at first glance, swallowed in shadow. But then my eyes adjusted and the faint points came into focus. They were closer than they had ever been before, sitting just beyond the first bend in the road. Low, unmoving, watching. I stared at them for so long that the cold crept into my fingers and numbed them. The stillness felt wrong now, like something holding its breath. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down I knew it was. Animals don't remain perfectly centered like that. They don't appear only when a single person is standing alone on a deserted road before dawn. And animals don't get closer only when you're not looking directly at them. The tension built slowly over the next few weeks. Every morning I would arrive at the stop hopping not to see the eyes. And some days I didn't, but the dread stayed with me anyway. I'd feel it before I even rounded the corner, a hollow tightness in my stomach, the kind you get before an important exam or an uncomfortable conversation. And then there were the nights when I would lie in bed and think about the road, wondering why the lights never moved like normal headlights, why they never flickered or swayed or dimmed. The thought that they might be something alive crept into my mind slowly, quietly, until it felt less like speculation and more like reluctant acceptance. The worst morning came in early March, when fog blanketed the fields so thickly I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. Even the streetlights looked muted, their halos swallowed by gray. The air smelled cold and damp, and each step toward the bench felt heavier than it should have. I sat down, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that the fog made everything sound quieter, too quiet. The hum of the nearby transformer was gone. The echoes of passing cars were gone. It felt like the world had pressed pause. I didn't want to look down the road that day. Something in me already knew what I would see. But fear has a way of drawing you in, not pushing you away. I turned. The eyes were there, not faint, not far, but close enough that I could see they weren't headlights or reflections. They floated at a height that made no sense, too tall for an animal, too low for a person, too wide apart to belong to anything ordinary. They didn't glow, they reflected, like they were catching whatever weak light managed to filter through the fog, and this time they didn't stay still. As I stared, frozen in place, they blinked, not quickly, slowly. A controlled, deliberate closing and opening, like someone acknowledging they finally had your full attention. My breath caught in my throat. The fog shifted slightly around them, and for one horrifying moment I thought I saw a shape behind the eyes, tall, thin, wrong, but the haze hid more than it revealed. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just sat there, my entire body trembling as I waited for something, anything, to change. And then it did. The eyes began to move forward, not with steps or swaying weight, but in one smooth glide, like something drifting through water rather than walking on solid ground. I stumbled back from the bench, my heart pounding. I wanted to run, but my legs felt numb, rooted to the cold pavement. The eyes glided closer, and just when they reached the edge of the fog's thicker layer, when I felt on some instinctive level that one more second would reveal too much, the bus arrived. The headlights of the approaching bus cut through the fog, and the eyes vanished instantly, as if they had never been there at all. The sudden noise of the brakes and the warm flood of interior light broke whatever spell had held me frozen. I climbed aboard without looking back. After that morning, I stopped taking the early bus. I rearranged my schedule, woke up later, did anything I could to avoid standing alone at that stop before sunrise. And I never saw the eyes again. But every time I pass by that road, even now years later, I feel the same pressure behind my ribs, the quiet warning that the darkness down there remembers me just as vividly as I remember it. Well, because the scariest part isn't that the eyes disappeared. It's that they were never meant to be seen in the first place. And the moment they knew I could see them, they moved closer. I moved into that countryside house during a period of my life when all I wanted was quiet. The kind of quiet you can't find in town, where cars pass every few minutes and there's always some buzzing light or distant music filling the background. Out there, nights had a different kind of stillness, deeper, almost heavy in the way it settled over the fields. Beyond my backyard was a wide, open stretch of land that belonged to my neighbor, an older man I rarely saw except when he rode his tractor to check the crops. The field stayed empty most evenings, a sea of tall grass that moved slowly when the wind passed through it. I used to step outside after dinner just to breathe in the cool air and stare out at that openness. It made the world feel bigger in a calm way. At first, nothing about the field felt strange. The only sounds were the soft hum of crickets and the rustle of grass swaying in the night breeze. My dog Luna would follow me out sometimes, sniffing around before lying beside me on the porch. She was a quiet dog, gentle and curious, never the type to bark without a reason. That's why it caught my attention the first time she hesitated at the edge of the porch, staring out toward a corner of the field as if something there bothered her. I didn't see anything unusual, just darkness, grass, and the faint silver sheen of moonlight brushing the landscape. But Luna wouldn't step off the porch. Her ears were up, her body tense, and she kept her gaze locked on that same patch of field long after I went back inside. I brushed it off. Dogs notice sounds we don't. Maybe she heard a fox or smelled a wild animal, but the next night it happened again. Luna stepped forward like she meant to explore, then stopped abruptly and backed up toward the door, staring into the same corner of the grass. This time I watched with her, trying to see what held her attention. At first there was nothing, just the long grass shifting softly in the wind. Then the wind died and the grass stopped moving entirely. That's when I noticed something small and subtle, two faint points of light hovering just above the height of the grass. They weren't bright, more like tiny reflections catching the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't flicker, and didn't shift the way an animal's eyes normally would. They simply stared back. I told myself it had to be something ordinary. A stray cat maybe, a deer, but those explanations didn't sit comfortably. The lights were too steady, positioned too perfectly to be the natural wobble of an animal holding its head. I watched for a few seconds longer, but the longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I felt. Luna whimpered softly, nudged my leg, and darted inside the moment I opened the door. I took one last look at the field before going in. Well, the lights were still there, as still as the air around them. Over the next few nights, I found myself stepping outside more cautiously. Part of me hoped the lights wouldn't be there, that whatever had caused them was gone. But almost every evening at around the same time they returned. Always in the same corner of the field, always motionless. And what bothered me most was that they only appeared when I stepped outside, never when I checked through the window. That detail stuck with me in a way I didn't like. It made me feel like the field waited for me to come out before revealing anything. I tried to get a closer look one night. I took a flashlight and walked just a few steps into the yard. Luna stayed behind, whining quietly. When I lifted the flashlight and pointed it toward the grass, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a small patch of field. But the lights vanished instantly. Not dimmed, vanished, as if they had ducked or turned away the second they were exposed. I held the light steady for a moment, then swept it slowly from left to right. Nothing, just grass and darkness. I lowered the flashlight, turning back toward the house. Then the lights reappeared. Exactly where they had been before. That moment stayed with me. I'd never seen animal eyes behave like that, disappearing with light only to reappear unchanged the moment darkness returned. Something about the stillness of them unnerved me, not aggressive, not threatening, just too aware, too patient. The tension grew in small ways. On windy nights, the grass would sway and brush against itself, creating a soft, rustling sound that usually relaxed me. But the corner of the field where the lights appeared never seemed to move with the rest. The grass there stood perfectly still regardless of the wind, as if something heavy weighed it down. When I realized that, an uneasy chill crept up my spine. I tested it by watching the field on a night when the wind was strong. Every part of the landscape danced under the gusts except that same corner. The grass there didn't shift once. I stopped going outside for a few evenings after that, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. It followed me through the windows when I passed by them, a quiet instinct tugging at my attention. I started waking up at night feeling like someone was standing just out of sight. The house was always silent when I checked, too silent, but I couldn't shake the pressure in the air. One evening, after a long, exhausting day, I noticed Luna packing nervously. She kept walking between me and the back door, whining in a way she rarely did. When I finally stepped outside with her, she pressed close to my leg, refusing to move farther than the first step of the porch. I followed her gaze. The lights were there, but this time they weren't hovering above the grass. They were higher and taller, almost level with my own eyes, as if whatever was out there had lifted itself onto something or stood up. My throat tightened. I took an involuntary step backward and Luna pressed even closer. The lights didn't shift or blink. They just stared back with the same unnatural stillness as before, but now from a height that ruled out any normal animal. I felt a subtle tremor pass through my arms, not from cold but from realization. The field was no longer watching from a distance. It was studying me. I should have gone inside right then. I should have trusted every instinct screaming for me to move. But instead, I grabbed my flashlight again, lifting it slowly. A part of me wanted a real answer, not assumptions, not guesses. I wanted to see what I had been dealing with for weeks. I took one cautious step forward and flicked the flashlight on. The beam cut across the field. Oh, there was nothing there. Not even the grass. I walked forward a little, unable to stop myself. The corner of the field where the lights had been looked different now flattened, pressed into a near-perfect circular shape as though something heavy had stood or crouched there for a long time. The grass was bent outward in all directions, radiating from the center. Luna barked sharply, the sound cracking through the silence. I spun around, but the field behind me was empty. That night I barely slept. Images kept replaying in my mind, the light's shifting height, the unmoving grass, the perfect circle in the field. By morning, I told myself I had overreacted, that fear had exaggerated everything. But when I stepped outside to check in daylight, the circle was still there. And worse, there were faint impressions around it, long and irregular, not like footprints, but more like drag marks, as if something had slid deeper into the field. Since then, I've changed the way I move around the house after sunset. I keep the blinds closed. I don't step onto the porch unless I absolutely need to. Luna refuses to go outside at night now, and I don't try to force her. Sometimes, when I lie in bed, I hear something faint, a soft, measured rustling, coming from the direction of the field. Not the playful movement of animals, but something slower, more deliberate. I don't see the lights as often anymore. But every once in a while, when the night is especially still, they appear again in that same corner. Never closer than before, never farther. Just there, waiting with quiet patience, as if the field knows my routine now as well as I once knew its silence. And the worst part isn't that I don't know what it is. The worst part is the growing feeling that whatever watches me from that field isn't gone at all. It's just getting better at hiding. I worked the night shift at a small storage facility on the edge of town, the kind of place most people forget exists until they need to stash old furniture or boxes of things they don't want to throw away. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and for a while that suited me perfectly. Most nights were predictable. Long stretches of stillness broken only by the low hum of the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the occasional creak from the metal siding expanding in the cool air. The storage units formed two long rows with a narrow corridor between them, just wide enough for a car to pass through during the day. At night, though, it felt more like a tunnel, dim, enclosed, and strangely hollow. The place had a rhythm I grew used to. Lights buzzing, bugs ticking against the lamps, my footsteps echoing off the concrete. I'd do my rounds twice a night, walking the corridor slowly, checking the locks and making sure nobody had tried breaking in. It was routine, boring even, and in the beginning I didn't mind the quiet. There was something peaceful about being the only person awake in a place full of other people's forgotten belongings. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen there. I didn't think anything could happen in a place so empty. The first irregularity came on a Wednesday near the end of my shift. One of the lights at the far end of the corridor flickered in a slow, almost rhythmic way, dimming until it glowed like a dying ember before snapping back to full brightness. I remember pausing halfway down the walkway, staring at that pulsing bulb. Something about it felt oddly deliberate, like someone gently squeezing a flashlight on and off. When the bulb dimmed again, I saw something glint in the darkness beneath it, a faint, reflective shine at about eye level. It was subtle, barely noticeable. I thought it might have been metal or maybe a locked latch catching the light. But when the bulb brightened, the reflection stayed exactly the same, unmoving. I shrugged it off. In places like that, shadows and reflections lie to you all the time. I finished my shift and didn't think about it again until the next night. That Thursday, the air felt colder, heavier, as though the temperature had dropped more than the weather should have allowed. I zipped my jacket and started my rounds. Everything felt normal at first until I reached the midpoint of the corridor. That same light at the far end flickered again, and there, right where the darkness thickened, were the same reflective points. Two of them, not bright, not glowing, just faint, steady glints hovering in the dark. I stopped walking. Something about the way they remained perfectly aligned made a small chill run down my spine. They didn't wobble like a dangling chain would. They didn't glimmer like metal. They stayed still, centered, watching. I waited for the lights to brighten, expecting the reflections to change or disappear. But the flickering bulb barely made a difference. Even when the light hit full strength, the reflections didn't fade or shift. They only became more distinct, two muted points at a height too exact to be anything random. I finished the round quicker than usual that night. As the days went by, I began noticing a pattern. I only saw the reflections when the far light flickered, never when it stayed steady, and never when I stood far back under the bright lamps near the office. Only when I entered that middle stretch of the corridor where the air felt oddly still and the ground seemed to swallow sound. The reflections always appeared at the farthest possible point from where I stood, always the very edge of the flickering radius. It was like something waited just outside the reach of proper light, lingering in the warped zone between brightness and shadow. I started dreading my rounds. During the fifth night of this strange routine, I brought a flashlight with me. Something about the storage facility felt different now, brittle in a way I couldn't name. Even before I reached the middle of the corridor, I felt the tension building in my shoulders. That sensation of being watched became so heavy that my steps grew slower without me consciously choosing to slow down. When I finally reached the halfway point, the bulb at the far end flickered weakly, casting a trembling aura across the pavement. And there they were again. The two faint glints, perfectly spaced, perfectly still, watching from a distance that felt intentional. I lifted my flashlight slightly but didn't turn it on yet. I wanted one more moment to convince myself this was something harmless. But as I stared, the glints blinked. Not like human eyes. Not like animal eyes. Just a smooth, synchronized dimming and brightening, as if they were adjusting to the amount of light available. My breath caught. I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it directly at them. Well, the light hit empty space. No persons, no animal, no metals, nothing. Just bare concrete and unit doors. But the moment I lowered the beam, the glints returned, closer this time, a few steps nearer to me, still holding their perfect alignment. My chest tightened so much I struggled to breathe. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the office, keeping my back straight, fighting the instinct to run. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. For the next week, I avoided looking down the corridor unless absolutely necessary. But there were moments when the fear pushed through my denial, moments when I caught myself glancing out the window toward the storage units even when I wasn't on rounds. Every time my eyes drifted toward that same patch of darkness, I never saw anything through the window, but I felt it. A pressure, a presence, like something waiting patiently for me to step outside. Then came the night the power went out. It was around 3 a.m., a time when the silence in that place felt thick and almost physical. One second the fluorescent lights were buzzing overhead, the next they snapped off, plunging everything into a suffocating darkness. I froze at my desk listening. The hum of the machines stopped, leaving only the faint ringing in my ears. The office window, normally a comforting barrier, now felt like a void opening into something I didn't want to face. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and stepped outside, because protocol required me to check the breaker panel. The air felt colder than ever, unnaturally cold, like stepping into a freezer. The beam of my flashlight cut through the blackness in a narrow, trembling line. I walked slowly along the side of the office building, my shoes tapping softly against the concrete. Then I stopped. Somewhere down the corridor, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy to be an animal, too soft to be a person walking normally. I shone the light down the tunnel of storage units. Nothing. Just darkness pressing in at the edge of the beam. The footsteps came again, closer now, and a subtle scuff echoed off the metal doors like something adjusting its stance. I lowered the flashlight slightly, just enough for the darkness to regain a fraction of ground. That's when they appeared. Two reflective glints. Not far this time. Not a distant, but suspended at human height only a few yards away. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. The glints didn't move, didn't blink. They just hovered there, catching the narrow slice of my flashlight's edge like something standing perfectly still, waiting for me to recognize it. I couldn't breathe, my body locked in place. And then, very slowly, the glints lowered, a subtle tilt downward, as though whatever they belonged to had leaned forward to get a better look at me. I turned and walked as calmly as I could back to the office, not daring to look again. My hand shook violently as I closed the door and locked it. The footsteps never followed. The glints never approached the window. But the feeling of something waiting outside, patient and focused, suffocated the room around me. I didn't finish the shift. I left the key on the counter and walked out at sunrise when the world felt real again. I emailed my resignation that afternoon. Months have passed since then. I haven't stepped foot near that storage facility again. But late at night, when a light flickers in my house or a shadow doesn't move the way it should, I feel it, the same cold, heavy stillness that lived in that corridor. And sometimes, when I catch a reflection at the edge of a dark room, part of me wonders if something followed me home. Not loudly, not aggressively, just watching. The same way it watched me every night I walked that lonely row of storage units. When I first moved into that apartment building, I liked how quiet it was at night. It wasn't new or modern, but it had a calm, lived-in feeling, the kind of place where the walls were thick enough to block out noise, and the long hallways carried a soft echo that always felt strangely comforting. My unit was near the middle of the third floor, facing a hallway that stretched all the way to a single large window at the far end. During the day, sunlight poured through it and warmed the corridor, making the space feel open and bright. But at night, when the automatic lights dimmed to save power, that window turned into a black square hovering at the end of a quiet tunnel. I didn't mind it at first. I told myself the dark was just part of living in a building with older lighting. Most nights when I came home late, the hallway was empty. I'd hear the soft buzz of the motion-activated lights warming up as I stepped inside, my footsteps muted by the carpet. The building always felt colder at night, as if the temperature dropped a few extra degrees once the last residents closed their doors. I'd walk down the hall, listening to the faint hum of the elevator machinery and the occasional creak of pipes behind the walls. The window at the end looked harmless then, just a simple glass pane reflecting the dim hallway lights. The first time something felt off was so subtle I nearly ignored it. I had just returned from a late shift, tired and ready to collapse into bed. As I stepped off the elevator, I noticed the lights weren't dimmed yet. They flickered for a moment before settling into their nighttime mode. When they dimmed, the reflection in the window shifted oddly, not like a normal reflection adjusting to light. It looked delayed, as though whatever the glass had been reflecting hadn't moved in sync with me. I blinked, leaned a little, watched my silhouette glide across the glass exactly as expected. Nothing strange, just exhaustion playing with my vision. But as I turned to walk to my door, I felt it, a small, involuntary pause inside me. The kind you don't question immediately but also don't forget. Something about that window pulled at my attention. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see only darkness, and that's when I noticed them. Two faint points in the glass, not bright, not glowing, just the softest suggestion of reflected light. Too small to be overhead fixtures, too low to be car headlights outside. They seemed to hover in the middle of the pane, too tiny. Still reflections that didn't belong to anything visible in the hallway. I told myself it was a trick of the dim lights or maybe a reflection from the exit sign down the stairs. But the shape wasn't right. The spacing wasn't right. And the longer I stared, the more those faint spots reminded me of eyes staring back from the other side of the glass. So when I finally looked away, I hurried to my apartment faster than usual. Over the next few weeks, those lights, those eyes, if I'm honest with myself, became something I checked for without meaning to. I'd step out of the elevator and look straight down the hallway, not because I expected anything, but because some part of me needed reassurance. Most nights the window looked normal, just a dark rectangle reflecting a dim hallway. But some nights when the lights shifted from bright to dim, there they were again, two faint glints, always faint, always still. And always in the exact same place. It was the stillness that unnerved me the most. Real eyes move. They shift with breath, blink, wobble slightly. These didn't. They stayed perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned, perfectly fixed on me, no matter how slowly I approached or how long I looked. I didn't mention it to anyone, partly because I didn't want to sound paranoid, and partly because I didn't know how to describe something so small that still managed to make the air feel heavy around me. The real turning point happened one night when I came home much later than usual. A storm had just passed, and the hallway felt colder and damper than usual. My shoes squeaked faintly against the carpet as I stepped off the elevator. The lights flickered to life, then dimmed again, and the moment they dimmed, the reflections appeared. Only this time, something was different. They blinked. Not dramatically, not with eyelids, but with a soft, momentary dimming that felt too intentional to ignore. My throat tightened as I stood there, frozen halfway between the elevator and my apartment door. I watched the window carefully, telling myself I was imagining things. But then the glints shifted slightly, not forward, not sideways, just a subtle tilt, almost like a head adjusting its angle. I forced myself to walk to my door, keeping my eyes on the window the entire time. The reflection stayed fixed on me until I slipped inside and locked the door, my hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. After that night, I avoided coming home late. I arranged my schedule, left earlier, did whatever I could to avoid seeing that window after the automatic lights switched to nighttime mode, and for a while it worked. The hallway looked normal when I passed through it during the day. Bright, innocent. The kind of place where the odd creaks of plumbing and flickers of old light fixtures felt benign rather than threatening. But it didn't last. One night after microwave leftovers and a movie, I woke up thirsty and stepped into the hallway outside my apartment to grab something from the storage closet across from my door. It was only a few steps outside my apartment. I didn't even bother turning on the hallway light. As I reached the closet, I felt a soft draft of cold air move past my ankles. Not unusual at first. Older buildings leak air in strange places. But the cold grew sharper the longer I stood there, like something was pulling the warmth away. As I turned to head back into my apartment, and froze. Down the hallway at the window, two faint reflections hovered at the height of a face looking directly into the corridor. But this time, they weren't behind the glass. They were level with the hallway itself. My entire body stiffened. The reflections didn't blink or move. They just stared, floating at the exact height of someone standing there. But there was no outline, no silhouette, no figure. Just 2 points of reflected light suspended where no one should be standing. As I slowly took a step back, my breathing quickened, each inhale sounding too loud in the silence. I didn't want to blink. I didn't want to break eye contact for even a second. I reached behind me for the closet door, but my hand fumbled, shaking too much to find the handle. The moment I blinked, the reflections vanished, not faded. Vanished. The hallway went empty again, silent except for the faint hum of electricity behind the walls. I moved quickly back into my apartment, locked the door, and leaned against it, listening for footsteps. None came. The air stayed still. But the dread stayed with me long after I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had truly seen something or if the darkness of the hallway had simply played a trick on me. A week passed with no incidents. I convinced myself that exhaustion had exaggerated everything, that old buildings distort reflections more than people realize. But late one night, something woke me, a faint noise like the soft click of a door latching. I sat up, listening. The hallway outside my apartment was quiet, but curiosity tugged at me even as my nerves protested. I opened the door just a crack. The hallway was dark. Pitch black. The automatic lights hadn't come on. At the far end near the window, something was moving. Slowly, subtly, a shape brushing against the carpet. I held my breath, squinting into the darkness. Then the reflections appeared. Right in front of my door. The two glints hovering inches above the height of the peephole. Not far away now, not distant, right at my threshold. I shut the door quietly, not slamming it, just closing it with deliberate, silent pressure, afraid that any sudden noise might draw attention. I didn't sleep that night, and a month later I moved out. I told myself it was because I found a better apartment closer to work. That's what I told friends, my landlord, myself. But the real reason followed me long after I left, the sense that whatever watched me from that window didn't belong to any reflection or shadow. It belonged to something that knew how to hide in darkness. Something that waited in hallways until the lights dimmed just enough to reveal it. And even now, in my new place, when the lights flicker during the night or when a window pane catches a faint reflection at the wrong angle, I feel that same cold awareness settle over me. Because sometimes I still see those two glints. Never bright, never clear. Is always in the corner of a dark hallway. Always waiting. There's something about nights like these that lingers long after the stories end. Maybe it's the way darkness holds its own kind of memory, or how the smallest glimmer can feel like a presence watching from the quiet edges of a room. Listening to these moments, these glimpses of eyes where no one should be, reminds us that fear doesn't always come crashing in. Sometimes it waits, patient and still, just outside the beam of a flashlight or the reach of a hallway light. And sometimes the things we see in the dark stay with us far longer than the moments themselves. As you lie there now, perhaps the room around you feels just a little different, quieter, heavier. Maybe you've caught yourself listening more carefully to the stillness or letting your eyes drift toward the corners you usually ignore. If so, you're not alone. These stories resonate because we've all felt that subtle awareness at least once, that sense of being observed when the night is too still, too deep, too quiet. We may never fully understand what waits in those shadows, but acknowledging that unease has a way of making us feel oddly connected, as though the darkness isn't something we face by ourselves. Before you drift off, take a slow breath. Let the weight of the night settle around you the way it settles around every place and person in these stories. And if you found comfort or curiosity in the quiet dread we walked through tonight, you're welcome to return here whenever you want more. You can subscribe or share this space with someone who listens the way you do, gently, patiently, with an open mind for the things most people choose to overlook. For now, I'll leave you to the quiet. Keep your lights low, your breathing steady, and your eyes closed if the dark feels a little too watchful. Sleep well, or at least as well as anyone can after remembering what might be staring back.